Okay, yeah, thank you for the introduction and thank you all for still being here and also for giving us so much time to discuss our paper and or it's not actually a paper, actually our project, and to get so much feedback on it. So I'm today presenting joint work with Merlin Schaeffer, who's also in this room now, and Pia Hagedorn, who's our student assistant who has got very much help in this project. And I'm going to talk about a new experimental design about the integration paradox, and I'll just go to what that means. This is a 2-year project that we're working on, and the idea is that we're going to collect a lot of data and write a lot of papers based on this, and we're still before the data collection actually, so we really appreciate any feedback. So first of all, the integration paradox. The integration paradox is something that has been found in a lot of research papers, and it shows that immigrants and their descendants who establish themselves among the middle class mainstream report more discrimination than those who remain at the margins of society. So this basically means that people who, for example, immigrants with better education or immigrants who have been in their destination country for a longer time or who are the 2nd or 3rd generation, they indicate that they're discriminated more than people who just arrived in a destination country or who have worse education. And this is in a way counterintuitive, because you would expect that people who get more similar in a way to the mainstream would be discriminated less and would also report less discrimination. And it's also different from what classic assimilation theory would assume, that namely that immigrants who establish themselves as part of mainstream society are discriminated less. So first of all, we did a meta-analysis of 43 articles on the integration paradox, and we find clear evidence that there is an integration paradox. I'm today not going to talk so much about this, so just good for you to know that this is the background that we're talking about. There is clear evidence that this is actually a thing. So what causes this integration paradox? Why is it that people who are more integrated, immigrants who are more integrated in their destination society, why do they experience more discrimination? The first mechanism is that people with better education who've stayed in a country for a longer time are actually more exposed to natives. So it could be that, for example, people who have better education and who have a job, that they encounter more natives, and therefore they also face more opportunities to be discriminated. So this could mean that people who are more integrated experience more discrimination and therefore also perceive more discrimination, as there's likely a link between actual and perceived discrimination. The second mechanism doesn't say anything about actual levels of discrimination, but says something about people's interpretation of the same events. So it could, for example, be that people who have been in a country for a longer time speak the language better and are therefore better able to pick up on discriminatory events. So, for example, if people say unpleasant things about, I don't know, someone's skin color, for example, people who speak the language better will actually understand what is being said and may therefore accurately interpret that as discrimination. And a sort of similar argument is about news consumption in the country. So if immigrants are more integrated, they may consume more local news, and they may therefore be more aware of how immigrants are portrayed in media. And if that's negative, then they may be more aware of being discriminated. And a sort of similar mechanism is that people who are more integrated are more sensitive to discrimination, so they're more aware of it happening, and therefore they may be more aware of that it also probably happens to them, and therefore they're more likely to frame similar experiences in terms of discrimination. And then there's a third branch of mechanisms, and that's about disillusion and relative deprivation. So this means that people who are better integrated may have higher expectations of their destination country, or for example, of their education. So they may expect, because they're higher educated, they will have better opportunities in the country. And then if it turns out that they are discriminated, they may be disappointed and interpret these experiences in terms of discrimination, both either because it is really discrimination, or either because they face more discrimination because they try to integrate more, or because they're more sensitive to it. So together, this is our theoretical model. So we made this model based on all the articles that are also in the meta-analysis. So these are the main three mechanisms that we identified. So integration affects perceived discrimination through social exposure, disillusion and relative deprivation, and cognitive awareness. And it affects both the opportunities to be discriminated and people's susceptibility to frame it as such. Okay, so there has been a lot of research on most of these mechanisms and on the integration paradox in general, but there is a gap. There are studies in which perceived discrimination is measured, and that is usually done by using a survey, asking people how much are you discriminated, basically, in different domains and in different contexts. And there are different studies in which actual discrimination is measured, for example, by using these audit studies where fake application letters for jobs, for example, are being sent out, and then it is compared how much less likely people, for example, with a foreign sounding name are hired for a job. However, there are no studies that directly compare the two. So based on these letter studies, you cannot say anything about people's perceptions because these are fake people, and fake people don't have perceptions. If you only look at survey data, you don't have any information about actual levels of discrimination. So we don't actually know how accurate people's perceptions of discrimination are. So is there a difference? Does integration help people to accurately perceive instances as discrimination? That's something we cannot answer based on the existing data. So what's missing in the model that I showed before is this part, the actual discrimination. So people who face more opportunities to face discrimination are probably are discriminated more and therefore perceived to be discriminated more. And the other mechanism affects the link between actual and perceived discrimination. So if people are more likely to frame experiences in terms of discrimination, they may more, that affects the link between actual and perceived discrimination. So the open questions that we aim to answer in this research is, so are the better integrated discriminated more? That's not necessarily a question we can answer with this study, but the main thing we focus on is, are the less integrated under perceiving the true extent of discrimination? So basically, does integration help people to understand that they're discriminated? So the main goal of our study is to compare perceived and actual discrimination using measures that closely mirror each other. So we don't have information about letters being sent out to compare with survey questions, but we want something that you can directly compare. And we do that in order to understand if differences in perceived discrimination reflect actual differences, or if there are really differences in perception only. And this helps us to understand which mechanisms are most important in explaining this integration paradox. All right, I'm now going to present our experimental design, and as I said, we're still working on this, so we don't have any results yet. So, as I said, what is very important in our experimental design is that our measures for actual and perceived discrimination closely mirror each other. And we're going to use surveys and investment games. And we aim to collect a sample of 2,000 respondents from the 5 largest German cities, of which half are native German and the other half have a migration background. And then of these 1,000 respondents with a migration background, 40% will have a Turkish background. And we're collaborating with a survey company to actually get to these people. All right, so we're using investment games to measure actual discrimination. And investment games provide a behavioral measure of trust and trustworthiness. It's a 2-person game. And I'll use these animations to show how it works. So in this game, there's a sender and a receiver. They both start the game with some money. In our game, it will be €10. Then the sender can choose to send some of that money to the receiver. And the money that is sent by the sender is tripled by us, by the researchers. So if the sender sends €5, the receiver will actually receive €15. then after that, the receiver can choose to return all, nothing, or part of the tripled amount. So in the example, the sender sends €5, that's tripled, that's 15, and then the receiver can, for example, return 10. And this means that both the sender and the receiver can be better off if the sender sends something and the receiver returns at least the same amount, because the tripled amount, they can basically split it up between them. However, the sender's decision is a measure of trust, because the sender will only send something to the receiver if the sender believes that the receiver will at least return the same amount, because the receiver can always choose to just keep everything and not return anything, and then the sender is clearly worse off than if the sender would not have sent anything. So we use this trusting decision to measure actual discrimination, and I'll explain that in a bit. In the study, we will not use anonymous games, but we will show information about senders and receivers. So in this example, I'm the sender, Merlin is the receiver, and we will show the participants the photos of their partners, and we also let them listen to a voice recording where they will say something like, I look forward to playing with you. And I must say that this is our ideal plan, but we're currently pre-testing the study, and it's quite difficult to get people to upload their photos and their recordings. So we may have to go with names, just first names as a signal of ethnicity and gender. But yeah, this would be our ideal setup, so I'll just stick with this for now. So this is what the screen is going to look like, more or less. So this is the sender decision, so how much of the €10 does the sender want to send to the receiver, and they can indicate that by sliding their slider. So every respondent plays this game 11 times with 11 different people. They will always play with one anonymous person. So in that case, they will not see the picture and they will not hear the recording and not see the name, if that's what we're going to go with. And then the game, like the composition of the games differs for native Germans and for people with an immigrant background. So native Germans play with 8 people with an immigrant background and with 2 native Germans. And people with the immigrant backgrounds play with 8 native Germans and 2 people with an immigrant background. In this game, there are 2 roles, senders and receivers, and we will let everyone play both roles. So they're first the sender, they make a sender decision, and then they make a receiver decision. And because we have so many respondents, it will not be possible to let them play all at the same time. So they will play it at their own time, and will later on match the sender and the receiver decisions to calculate the actual payments, and will therefore use the strategy method. So that means, because in this case, if I'm playing with Merlin, but Merlin may not at all yet have finished the survey, then we don't know how much he sent me. So instead of asking me, in this case, the receiver, how much would you like to return? If Merlin sends you 4, how much would you like to return? We ask, okay, so this person sent you €2, how much would you then like to return? And if this person sends you 4, how much would you like to return? So based on this, we can later on match the real decisions. Then after playing all of the 11 games, we let the respondents select 2 games for payment. So they're not actually getting paid for all of the 11 games, because that would be too costly. We let them select 2 of the 11 games, and first we thought we just randomly select some games, but now we decided to let people select their own games as a second measure of trust. So actually, one of our colleagues noted that it could happen that there's very little variation in the actual sending decisions, so people send more or less the same amount to everyone, and by making them choose between these 11 games, we actually force them to indicate who they would trust most and which game they would prefer over the others. So it's a second measure of trust. All right. I've now explained the game, which is a measure of actual discrimination, and I'll now explain how we actually calculate actual discrimination based on all these measures. So in this example, we have Merlin, who's a native German, as the sender, and myself, who's an immigrant in Germany, as the receiver. And if we're going to calculate how much I am discriminated by Merlin, we'll compare either the amount that Merlin sent to me with how much Merlin sent to all the others, or we compare the amount that he sent to me with how much he sent in the anonymous game where no information is available, or we compare how much he sent to me with the amount he sent to the native Germans. And based on this, we will just get an individual level of discrimination, that is discrimination by Merlin of me. And we'll get this 11 times for me because I'll play with 11 others. So I get actually 11 individual measures of actual discrimination. Yeah. All right, so now we have our measure of actual discrimination. Then now we're measuring perceived discrimination. And as you remember, this should closely mirror our measure of actual discrimination. So what we do is, after playing all these 11 games, we let people go back to each of these games, show the pictures again, show the recordings again. And we ask them, okay, how much do you think this respondent sent to you? So in this case, how much do you think Merlin sent to me? And how much do you think Merlin sent to others? So how much do you think this person sent to all others? And if there's a difference between the two, so if you think that the respondents think that the other person sends more to others than to themselves, we'll ask them, okay, why do you think that is? These are that we use it within subjects design here, and some of the games are incentivized. So for some games, people get €3 if they guess both amounts correctly, and for other games, they get nothing, to see if people are better at guessing if it's an incentivized decision. So if they're really motivated to make the right guess, are they then better at doing this? We also ask people, do you think that the other person selected this game for payment? And again, if they select no, we ask them, why do you think that is? And this is also an incentivized decision. So this is our measure of perceived discrimination, but as you can see, this is more of an expectation of discrimination, because people have no information whatsoever about distributions in these games, like what is an average amount being sent, and what should I compare it to? So we also later on have a measure of perceived discrimination. So we give people some information. Okay, Merlin on average sent, I don't know, €5. How much do you think that you get? And then again, we ask if this is less than the average Merlin sent, why do you think there's a difference? So that looks more or less like this. So this is the page that we will show where people can indicate their guesses. So they can move sliders to say, okay, I think Merlin sent so much to me, so much to others. I think Merlin selected this game or not. And then the question about if there are differences between the amounts, we let them choose why do you think there's a difference. So is it because of your accent, your age, your body weight, your dialect, your skin color? We have a lot of different reasons in there. So this the study consists of 3 parts. We're currently working on a pre-game survey. We're actually pre-testing it, and the goal of this is to we want to get a general measure of perceived discrimination in everyday life. So this is very similar to other surveys where perceived discrimination is measured. This is also the time where we collect measures of ethnic identity, so where are people born and where are their parents born, and measures of integration, so education, length of residency, and generational status. This is also the time where we hope to collect portrait pictures and recorded sentences. And then there are a number of other measurements like control variables and mediators and moderators. So for this phase, we hope to get about 3,000 respondents, and they'll all get €20 cash if they complete the survey. Then the second part is the part that I talk most about today. So these are the investment gains that we're planning for the fall. So this is the phase where we collect our measure of actual discrimination and our most of the measures for perceived or expected discrimination. We hope that of the 3,000 respondents who participated in the first part, 2,000 will also participate in the second part, and they can actually earn up to €60 in this part. And we plan to pre-register this study and our hypotheses. Yeah, we plan to do that before the data collection. And then the last phase will be in winter 2021, 2022, next winter. And here is where we will get our last measure of perceived discrimination, and we will also inform the respondents about the payments of the second part. All right, so to conclude, based on our meta-analysis, we can say that there is evidence for integration paradox, but there's also a gap in the literature. So is the integration paradox caused by a difference in actual discrimination, or by more accurate perceptions, or by both? And our new experimental design is aimed at measuring actual and perceived discrimination in the same domain. And it may be a bit artificial, so this is not real discrimination, for example, in the labor market, but it is the first attempt to measure and predict individuals under and over perceived discrimination. So we think this is an important contribution to the literature because it has never been done before. All right, so that was it for today. I'm really looking forward to your comments and the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, first of all, thanks to the organizers for inviting me to do this. And thanks especially for assigning me this specific paper. I really enjoyed reading it for a number of reasons. Let's see if I can get this progress. Okay, so first of all, I want to applaud just begin by saying a few things that I really like about this project. First of all, I want to applaud the authors for asking a really important question, and using experiments, I think, is an interesting and ambitious way of answering that question. And I was particularly excited about what the authors are doing here, since a PhD student and I have a paper under its second round of review arguing that experiments provide a really underappreciated tool for studying the potential disconnects between actual discrimination and perceived discrimination. So just so you know where sort of I'm coming from in my comments on this particular paper, the paper that the PhD student and I have under review studies discrimination in a simulated employment context. And the participants in that study were all parents, and we either explicitly discriminated against them by not promoting them to a valued position because they were parents, and we used the standard line about they may not have the time and commitment necessary to do the sort of the higher status job, or denied them a promotion for purely benign reasons, that everyone wanted the more valued position and we had to pick someone to do the less valued one. So people in our study were either clearly discriminated against or not, and we measured whether participants perceived and labeled their treatment as discrimination. And so we showed, among other things, that there were many false negatives. That is, a lot of people who were discriminated against, a lot of mothers who were discriminated against, did not perceive or label that as discrimination. And we found virtually no false positives. That is, we found no people saying that they were discriminated against when they really were not. And as you might expect, gender ideology was a very strong predictor of false negatives. So women who subscribed to more traditional gender role ideologies were less likely to label what was very much discrimination as discrimination. So I've been thinking recently about using experiments to study discrimination, especially how perceptions of discrimination may or may not diverge from actual discrimination. So this paper was a real treat to read. So I want to begin with an overview of the questions and comments that I will have, and I will begin with sort of how the main theoretical constructs, discrimination and perceived discrimination, are operationalized in the study. And this is really the devil's advocate portion of my comments. I tried to take my trust cooperation researcher hat off and put on my, to whatever extent I possess a discrimination researcher hat, that hat on. And I'll spend a lot of time on that and invite rebuttals that I'm completely off base on my comments here, encourage them even. And then I will turn to some miscellaneous questions and suggestions about the design, several of which were anticipated very nicely in Judith's presentation. So just to get us all on the same page again, Judith and Merlin start with this very interesting paradox, and their main claim that they're going to test is that better integrated immigrants perceive, or at least report perceiving, more discrimination than immigrants who are less well integrated. And they do a very good job of outlining the possible mechanisms here and the possible explanations. So the first thing that I want to ask is to what extent does the design answer these research questions? All right, and I would argue that it depends on the extent to which we accept that trust game behavior is a good measure of discrimination, number one. And number two, that trustees' expectations of trusters' behaviors map onto perceptions of discrimination, right? So I'll take each of these in turn. So first of all, does relatively less trust approximate more discrimination, or does the trust game and differences in trust based on trustees' ethnic or immigration background capture discrimination, and if so, how broadly? So it depends on what we mean by discrimination here. So researchers coming at this from a more traditional, if you read, say, an annual review of sociology piece on discrimination, those researchers might doubt the extent to which these findings are generalizable to questions of perceived discrimination that motivates a lot of their work. Like, you know, are they less likely to be promoted? Can they get bank loans? Is there housing discrimination? Are they hassled by the police? These sorts of discrimination, these sorts of conceptions of discrimination, right? So to get at what I'm driving at, consider studies, the studies from the trust literature showing that women are trusted more than men, right? So are we comfortable with the conclusion that men are discriminated against? I mean, I guess they are in a limited sense, but it is women who face much higher levels of discrimination of the type that we typically think about, you know, in wages, promotions, everyday treatment. And we can say the exact same thing for age. The trust literature looks at how age determines whether someone's trusted, and people tend to trust older people more, which contrasts with the age discrimination that we see, say, in the labor force, right? So I'll say a bit more about this later, but I think one thing that's useful to discuss, and a point that I'll keep coming back to, is I think it would be useful to discuss the rationale and benefits of calling this a study of discrimination, which I think could bring to mind biased treatment in housing, employment, you know, treatment by the police, versus, say, category-based trust, which would imply different theoretical arguments. And I think related to that point, I think it would be useful to discuss the implications of results from these studies for the broader discrimination literature. And I'll say quite a bit more about that in a moment. So in addition to whether trust in the trust game is a good measure of discrimination, we can also ask whether the trustees' expectations about what the truster did in the trust game is a good measure of perceived discrimination, again, as traditionally understood. At least in the second phase that Judith was referring to, I don't think there's any basis for really perceiving discrimination. There's a basis for expecting discrimination, but not perceiving it. And I think it's a reasonable assumption that, you know, expectations will influence perceptions in a sort of a believing is seeing kind of way. But while we might be primed to perceive something that we expect, expecting a given outcome versus perceiving that a specific outcome resulted from discrimination are very much distinct. And I think the role of expectations, I think we can see the distinction here in how expectations play different roles in the different causal mechanisms that the authors outline. So in the relative expectations literature, and I was more convinced by this in Judith's presentation, because she brought in the role of disillusions here, but I'll go ahead and say this just as a basis of conversation. In the expectations mechanism, as I understand it, expecting good outcomes, say low discrimination, I think will lead to more perceived discrimination. And so one question here is, according to this mechanism for, say, well-integrated immigrants, should their expectations be high or low? Should they be high based on the fact that they're well integrated, and then those expectations are foiled in the here and now? Or should their expectations be low based on this history of mistreatment, so they should come into the study with low expectations? I think that maybe could be fleshed out in thinking about how this mechanism can be tested, and the hypothesis falsifiable in this particular, clearly falsifiable in this particular design. And then we can see that expectations play a somewhat different role in the actual discrimination mechanism, whereby integrated immigrants accurately perceive higher levels of discrimination and thus report higher levels of discrimination. Here, expectations should be positively related to perceptions, since both follow actual discrimination experiences. But note that this assumes that to participants, the trust game behavior will correspond closely to other forms of discrimination. But what if it does not, as in the cases of gender and age that I mentioned on the previous slide, where let us call them real world instances of discrimination, run counter to behavior, trusting behavior in the trust games. So more generally, if we want the results to inform the broader discrimination literature, it may be useful to think about why and when the results for the behavioral trust measure might run counter to discrimination in employment, housing, and so on. Said differently, and I promise I'll move on to a different issue after this. Imagine that and you no longer have to imagine this, I know from your presentation that you actually will do this, you're going to measure immigrants' trust towards native Germans as well. So imagine, and maybe this is your expectation, that you find the following. Integrated immigrants trust native-born Germans less than they trust other integrated immigrants. And native-born Germans expect that integrated immigrants will trust native-born Germans less than they will trust integrated immigrants. Would we call that discrimination in both directions? And what are the relative advantages of calling it discrimination in both directions versus category-based trust? And I think this has implications for the theoretical background that you're drawing on and that you're speaking to. Okay, so other considerations, and this is the grab bag of issues. Now, I don't even need to cover this issue because you noted that you will decouple trust from generosity in your design by giving the trustee an endowment as well, and this allows you to distinguish trust from generosity, which I think is important because you could have native-born Germans, quote unquote, trusting less integrated immigrants more than they trust more integrated immigrants because they perceive them as higher need and thus want to give more to them. But I think your design, as you made clear in your presentation, nicely decouples trust from generosity. So you no need to worry about that consideration. Now, I think a couple of considerations that I would encourage you to think about is, if I understand you correctly, months will pass between the second phase, when participants will make their decision, and the third phase, when they will be paid for them. And so given future discounting, we likely should be concerned how much they will care about payoffs, and thus about their decisions, and thus about your manipulations in phase two. So this future discounting may have the effect that it would reduce any impact of your manipulations, because they made you be less concerned about payoffs that happen so far in the future. Second is that research by Robin Dawes, John Orbell, and others shows that individualizing information tends to lead to more trust in alters. So having a photo of someone, even if this is an integrated immigrant who your hypothesis states they would be ordinarily less apt to trust, having a photo of them, hearing them talk, may lead to more trust relative to the no information condition, which is counter to one aspect of your hypothesis, right? So it's maybe an overly conservative test of your hypothesis. You're making it a bit too hard on yourself, I think, if individualizing information leads to more trust. So I want to sum up by primarily going back to some of the things I said earlier. I see very much the logic of the prediction that a native-born German trusting another native-born German more than they trust an immigrant. But as I said earlier, would it also, or as I asked earlier, would it also be discrimination if the immigrant trusted an immigrant of the same background more than they trusted the native-born German? Again, it depends on how we define it, but however we define it, we can ask, to what extent does this parallel the social problem that you're trying to address? That is that low trust and integrated immigrants. No one, as far as I know, is particularly worried about discrimination against native-born German. Well, that's clearly wrong. I think there's a contingent of people who are worried about discrimination against native-born Germans, but that's not who you're worried about. So the question is what would those two patterns, so, you know, trust is low in the off diagonal versus trust is low, only low for native-born German trusters and immigrant trustees, say about your underlying theory? Or, you know, what if you find that better integrated immigrants face less discrimination than less well integrated immigrants? What would that mean vis-a-vis the discrimination literature and this paradox that motivated your research? You know, so would you interpret this as counter to the patterns that motivated your work, or simply distinct? And, you know, I think considering these issues, and, you know, you can make a very cool project even more impactful. And I very much look forward to seeing where this goes. Thank you.